could, I'll allow an introduction of the board members. I'll start on the right with Pat.
My name is Pat Faubert. I've just become a regular voting member, not an alternate, so I have been here for both of the discussions, or all the discussions for the things, the public hearings for tonight, so I will be able to vote tonight on those.
John Campbell.
Ron Vigil.
Russ Gagner, chairperson.
Diane Moran.
I'm Phil Saucier with the town attorney, not a board member.
Okay, I believe all the board members have received a copy of the minutes from the last
I'll make
board
a
meeting.
motion that the minutes for February 28 be approved as presented to us.
I second it.
Discussion? Before I go into vote, I do think, for the record, important that we ask Mr. Bellissimo to just validate the wording associated with the votes and what in favor meant with respect to the variance appeal that we did. That wasn't necessarily clear to me that where we said motion passed, that meant that it failed the statute, et cetera. So I'll make sure that when either myself or Mr. Vigu signs the letter, and again, if Jim can just make sure he makes sure he understands that, we need to make sure that that's clear and clarified. All's in favor for accepting the minutes as written for the record?
Aye.
In favor, aye. So a 5-0 vote to accept the minutes. The first hearing we have tonight is a request to revisit Board of Appeals decisions on hardship standards from Ms. LaPierre with respect to Portland Street R72-5. So Ms. LaPierre has met with the town and has asked for another opportunity to review her case. Ms. LaPierre.
So according to James, it looks like we needed 3 hardship questions to be overturned. So in my response to the first hardship question, where the land cannot yield a reasonable return without a variance, the land in question has been for sale since February 12th of 2016. The building has 10 units in which only 3 of those units are occupied. As the land in the building currently sit, there's not much interest in the property except for me and what I was looking to do. The current owners cannot yield a reasonable return at this time as they cannot sell the property with the way that it sits, and they also have a hard time leasing out the remaining office spaces there. And I would also like to add one more note with what Mr. Page had said last time with some health issues. You know, the building, it will be difficult for him to keep it up. So as the building deteriorates, that'll also won't yield a reasonable return as it'll become more difficult to sell. Move on to the next one.
Yeah, you have the form.
Okay. With the second hardship question, the need for the variance is due to the unique circumstances of the property. The building is currently a mixed-use property. The unique circumstance basically is changing the use to primarily residential, and the amount of acreage that would be needed to change that to the residential use. In the third hardship question, the hardship is not due to the action of any prior applicant or owner. This hardship is being created by the change of the use from mixed use to the residential and the zoning requirements for that residential use. The residential use suits better the property versus the building sitting, like I said, mostly vacant at this point. And that was it.
Any other discussion on the behalf of the applicant from the public? Any discussion by the board?
I don't have anything, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Do I have any motions from the board?
I wanted to ask a question. Are there any new developments or new facts that we need to know? Have any of the adjacent landowners or tenants, people who have deeded rights to the land and the land right of way next to you and nearby in proximity to you, offered to cooperate in any sense? In a way to give you more land area, or has there been any change in the septic system situation or the water situation?
We've looked at, in terms of, we originally looked at with the neighbors, but the way that the zoning reads and the amount of land that would be needed, I believe, don't quote me off the top of my head, but it's, here in Kathy's memo, is 639,410 square feet. So I think it was roughly about 12 acres total. So that really is not feasible. In terms of the water and the septic, we have the septic system. We have that situation figured out where we would just install a second septic tank, install the White Knight pre-treatment, which would basically allow for the design flow that is required. In my previous stuff, there's a letter from Ken Gardner, who is a septic engineer. In terms of the water, Mr. Pendergast had stated prior that, the way that the water sat currently, he didn't think it was sufficient enough, so I had already mentioned to him that I would, drill a new well at that point on the land.
Any other discussion from the board? I'd like to make a motion to reconsider hearing this application for a variance. A yes vote on this motion, a motion to reconsider, would mean that we would open up the case and rehear the entirety of the case. A no vote would mean that we would not hear the case, and we will move on to the next.
Excuse me. Can I respond to her before you vote?
I'll give you the, to respond in what way? Can I?
Just, I'm the neighbor.
Okay.
And I've never seen her before. So,
Okay.
This is the first time, unfortunately, I don't know if there was even a previous thing to this, there must have been.
Yes, sir, this is the
that
third.
I never got a letter for.
That's fine, sir. With respect to where we are, if you want to present more, but right now with respect to where we are, this is the third, right.
I mean, I
Yep.
should have brought the letter
Yep.
with me.
Understood.
Unfortunately, I got a letter in the mail that actually came from the post office in a special envelope saying they were sorry that my letter was so damaged.
So, so just to be clear, the motion that I've put before the remainder of the board, and has not been seconded yet, was, again, a motion to reconsider. If the board votes yes on this motion, we will reconsider the case in its entirety right now at this hearing. And again, if a no vote on this motion would mean that we would pass over this opportunity to reconsider, and we will move on to the other half of the hearing.
I'll second the motion.
Okay. Roll call vote. Does everybody understand the question?
To reconsider.
It's a vote whether to open to
Yeah,
reconsider.
so again, since I made a motion, it was seconded. Continued discussion on the motion?
No.
Campbell?
I vote no.
No.
I also vote no.
No.
Motion fails.
And that's based on really, in my opinion, there has really been no other presentation of that has changed any of the facts that we've heard before us at the other prior meetings.
I'll concur.
Going to move on to an administrative appeal of code enforcement officer's decision associated with Philip LeMay, reason building permit issued at 183 Cranberry Meadow Road, R3710. I will give the opportunity for the appellant to present their evidence. I will then move on to the property owner to provide their evidence, and then a code enforcement officer to provide their evidence, and any public, and open up for other opportunities for evidence to be presented from the public. And then I will close the public forum at that point for discussion by the board. So again, sir, thank you.
Good evening, Chairman Gagner and board members. I am Dave Pearson. I'm attorney for the LeMays. And I guess I don't want to spend too much time repeating unnecessarily things that you've already heard. I know we had a discussion of this at the last meeting and things were continued. I assume by now that everybody has received all the materials, the submissions by all the parties, and had a chance to review them. But I think to just lay things out succinctly, and then I'd certainly be happy to respond to any questions the board may have, is the ordinance as it was drafted, in effect when the permit was issued, did not permit the demolition of a structure and then its replacement on a non-conforming lot. And the permit was very clear that that was what was allowed. I think it's also important to look back at the ordinance, and that states that a permit that's issued that's not in conformity with the ordinance is void and creates no vested rights. The argument has been made that this really isn't that this is a renovation or a reconstruction under section 5.283, but this is, tearing down an entire structure and replacing it with a new one is not a renovation or repair or remodeling. That's something that you do that makes significant changes in the structure, but the structure is still there, or at least a significant part of it is still there. There has been some recent case law that the town's attorney pointed out that dealt with a similar issue up in North Haven, where they interpreted a very similar ordinance provision regarding the reconstruction after a casualty loss that said, you could rebuild after a property is destroyed by fire or other casualty, but not by the willful act of the owner or the owner's agent. But in that case, while it's somewhat similar, what was happened there is a major portion of a structure was demolished, but a portion of the structure still remained, and so the town determined that this was basically the rehabilitation and renovation of an existing structure that still remained. Here, no part of the structure remained. It was a complete, total demolition and an entirely new structure put on the property. I suppose it might be possible to look at this from the perspective of if it were a vacant lot of record, the non-conforming lot of record, it would be possible potentially to build on that, but that would require meeting all the dimensional requirements in the ordinance. And because of the size of the lot, it's impossible to meet those dimensional requirements because the lot is so narrow that you could not have a 25-foot setback on either side. So the only other way to do that under the ordinance, again, is with a variance, and variances are the province, the exclusive jurisdiction to grant variances is vested with this board, and so no variance was sought and no variance granted. So even if one sort of read this ordinance in a way to allow that and say, okay, you can create a non-conforming, a lot that's vacant and non-conforming by demolishing a structure on it, and then get a permit. Again, it would have to come to this board to get a permit for the variance. There's nothing in the state law or in the town's ordinance that gives the code enforcement officer authority to vary setbacks. I understand that there's a provision that envisions deviations from the setback, but again, that's something that's not, there's no authority for the CEO to make those decisions. That is something that gives authority to this board to make those decisions. And it, really limits the authority of the board as to exactly how much it can do. And I think it's important to look at, the variance is a relaxation of the terms of the ordinance. That's what's defined. And, section 10.4A gives the board the authority to grant dimensional variances. And that's what the, a reconstruction on this, or a new construction on this, on the Elliott property would require. So, again, there's no variance. The ordinance, as the town recognized after the LeMays filed their appeal, did not allow the demolition and replacement of structures on a non-conforming lot. So, I'd certainly be happy to to respond to any questions the board has, but I think it's been, I don't want to just say things I've said 3 times before to you, so.
Understand, sir. And yes, we all do have the packages of information
Yeah.
this time, so excellent. We're starting from a better place than last time.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Right, sir.
Hello, I was here last month, David Goldman for Rose Elia. So I too would prefer to avoid repeating myself to the maximum extent possible, but that said, last time we were kind of operating a little in a vacuum since you didn't have the submissions, so I'm just going to lay out my understanding of the argument and what the ordinance requires. Essentially, and as we said in our brief, the ordinance section 5.2A3 allows for, it says this ordinance allows repairs, renovations, or modernizations which do not involve the expansion of the non-conforming use or structure. The exhibit to our brief showed that that this isn't actually any expansion on the amount of area being taken up. The old modular home that was there took up a little more than 1,500 square feet of area. The new one is a little under 1,500 square feet of area. So section 5.2A3, by its terms, allows what was done here as long as it can be interpreted as a renovation or modernization. In the context of a modular home, this is really the only way a renovation or a modernization can occur. Now there was a reference to this case that the town's attorney pointed out, Wolfram versus Town of North Haven. And that case is actually pretty instructive, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but the ordinance there was very similar to the one here. And what happened there was the owner of the lot it was on a non-conforming lot. There was a structure that was essentially destroyed. I mean, it was characterized as just now as a piece of the structure being left behind, but in the case, it says that the applicant submitted a second application for a land use permit seeking authorization for, quote, wrecking, described as a partial tear down that would leave a small piece of the previous structure in place. So it's just not, it's not a fair characterization to say that this was, what was going on here was simply, a renovation of an existing structure. They may have left a small piece in place, but they wrecked the existing structure and built a new one. And so the ordinance in that case, it had sections like the ones here. One allowed, in the case of willful acts, that a non-conforming structure can be repaired, maintained, or improved. That's as compared with our ordinance here that allows repairs, renovations, and modernizations. It also had a section like we have here that's almost a word-for-word duplication talking about of our ordinance. It says, any non-conforming use or structure which is hereafter damaged or destroyed by fire or cause other than the willful act of the owner or agent may be restored or reconstructed to its original dimensions and used as before. The argument was made in that case, like the argument's been made here, that, well, the ordinance provided for the reconstruction in the case of a non-willful act, like a fire or some other destruction, but it didn't explicitly say anything about reconstructing it for willful acts. Therefore, if it's a willful act, you can't reconstruct the structure. The Maine Supreme Court rejected that argument explicitly, and it said it didn't make any sense as a matter of interpretation of that ordinance, and in that case, the essential reconstruction was allowed. I think that basically puts to bed the idea that the fact that the ordinance here talks about what happens in the case of a willful destruction, or it talks about what happens in the case of a fire and the ability to reconstruct in the case of a fire, means that you can't reconstruct in any other situation. The only question is whether it's fair to characterize, in our case, what was done as a modernization or renovation. And I would say that, in Wolfram, rebuilding the structure was fairly characterized as a maintenance or improvement. And I don't see how that language is any less strong as allowing for a reconstruction than the language in the ordinance at play here. So just under section 5.2A3 of the ordinance, my client should be allowed, or the permit was properly issued. But the CEO actually rested his issuance of the permit on a different provision in the ordinance, which was section 6.3 note 6, which talks about, so section 6 of the ordinance refers to the general rules for what's required in terms of setbacks, but this note 6 says that in the case of, for all structures, side and rear setbacks may be reduced by the percentage that the non-conforming lot is less than the requirement. This is where the math comes in, and in our case, our lot is 14,000 square feet. The general requirement is for 60,000 square feet. So our property is 23% of what would be required generally. And so you take that 23% and you apply it to the 25-foot setback requirement that's generally required. 23% of 25 feet is 5.75 feet. In our case, our structure is set back more than that. The permit allowed for a setback between, I think it was 6 and 7 feet. But in any event, it was more than 5.75 feet. So the only argument against the concept that note 6 here allows my client to do what she did is that note 6 only applies in the case of a variance by the board. But as I pointed out last time, there's nothing in note 6 or anything in the notes that says these notes are to be applied only in the case of a variance. There's nothing in the variance section that talks about these notes. These notes are right under the general dimensional requirements section in the ordinance and should be read together with it. The note provides the dimensional requirement for a case of a non-conforming structure. Nothing to do with a variance. And in fact, when you look at the variance section, which is section 10.4, if I can find it in the ordinance, section 10.4D talks about the discretion that the board is given to affect dimensional requirements when granting variances. It just leaves it to your discretion. It says the board shall limit any variances granted as strictly as possible in order to preserve the terms of the ordinance as much as possible, and it may impose such conditions to a variance as it deems necessary to this end. And that is characteristic of how variances work. It leaves it to you, as the board, when a variance is requested, to determine whether and to what extent a variance is appropriate. Nothing in here says, and your discretion is limited by what was in note 6 of section 6, because that's a completely different section of the ordinance. So I would just submit that there is nothing in note 6, there's nothing in the variance section of the ordinance that implies that those two things are to be read together, that note 6 only applies in the case of a variance. Note 6 provides the general dimensional requirement for a non-conforming lot when a renovation litigation happens. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but for now, I think I covered the ground.
So the case that you were referring to at the beginning, with respect to the destruction of a property, where is that is that in the background, or is that something that was presented new?
Yeah, no, that was something that actually the town's attorney told both of the attorneys about at the end of the meeting, and I looked it up. It's generally available from,
Okay.
I'm sure that your attorney could provide you
I
with
was
a
just
copy of the case.
trying to validate that it
Yeah.
wasn't
And,
sitting here in front of me.
I thought once the public portion is, I'll just mention that case since they both mentioned it. We haven't had a chance to talk since that meeting, but I let both of the attorneys know about this case because it's on point and just so that they would address it this time.
Okay.
We can talk about that.
Thank you, sir.
May I address a couple things?
Yeah, I'll open up the floor, sir.
Thank you. I think it's really important, it was critical to the case in North Haven, the Wolfram case, that at least a portion of the structure was saved, and it was allowed it was treated as an expansion of a non-conforming use as permitted by that specific ordinance. And so I think the case really doesn't inform your decision in any significant way in this particular instance. I also would like to point out that section 10.4F of the Berwick ordinance deals with setback variances for single-family dwellings. That sets out a specific standards for that, and it says, that an ordinance adopted under this subsection may permit a variance from a setback requirement only when the strict application of the zoning ordinance to the petitioner and the petitioner's property would cause undue hardship. And then it gives a different definition of undue hardship that is different from the standard definition. And that says, it's tailored to the specific situation where you have a lot that is non-conforming, and as a result of the non-conformity, it can't practically be built on. So I think the board needs to look to that, not to the general authority. And I agree with Mr. Goldman. Note 6 doesn't specify exactly who has the authority to grant this deviation from the setbacks that are required under the ordinance. But when you look at the state law, gives the Board of Appeals the exclusive authority to grant variances and to deal with dimensional issues, provided the town's ordinance gives the board that authority. The only situation a CEO is allowed to, under state law, to make decisions that go contrary to those kinds of zoning ordinance requirements is when it involves somebody who's disabled and the need for structures to enable someone to access their home. So in other words, if this, the CEO would have the authority under state law, provided the town gives them the authority, to allow somebody to build a ramp to get into their house, even if it encroaches within a setback and wouldn't otherwise be permitted. There's nothing in the ordinance that gives the CEO any power to do anything other than examine the permit application and determine if it complies with the ordinance. If it does comply with the ordinance, building permit application, then the CEO is directed by the town's ordinance to issue the permit. If it doesn't, he or she is directed to deny the permit and state the basis for that denial in writing. There is no real discretion there. And finally, while I understand the theory that you could look at the dimensional requirements, deviations from the dimensional requirements in terms of the lot area, it frankly makes little sense to talk about lot area when you're talking about a dimensional requirement, and it makes a lot more sense to look at the width of the lot and see how that varies from the requirements and make mathematical calculation on that basis, as I laid out in the written materials. But I think the key issue here is, one, this doesn't involve a renovation or a modernization or a repair. This is building a whole new building. The case that has been cited, while it provides maybe some idea of how to think this process through, involves fundamentally different facts. That involves reconstructing a building that has been partially demolished as part of the reconstruction and expansion. So, I thank you very much. I appreciate it.
So again, yeah, so for full opportunity and to put as much evidence on the floor, Mr.
I
Goldman.
will, this time, try to be extremely brief. I'll leave it largely to the discussion with the town's attorney to talk about how applicable that Wolfram case is. I'll just reiterate that in that case, it was a wrecking that was done with only a small piece left over. And that kind of gets at something I mentioned last time, that according to the theory on the other side, we could have taken down our original structure wall by wall, one piece at a time, and replaced the whole thing, but we couldn't do it all at once, and that's just not a logical reading of it. And the other thing I'll say is, we can all agree that the CEO didn't have the authority to hand out variances, but that's begging the question here. The dimensional requirements are what they are. That section 6.3 says, here are the dimensional requirements, subject to note 6, which says that for non-conforming lots, the setback requirements can be reduced by the percentage to which the entire lot is non-conforming. And these notes have to be read together with the dimensional requirements, and when you look at all the other notes, it's characteristic of them being read together with the dimensional requirements. I mean, note 9 says 1 acre equals 43,560 square feet, or 4,840 square yards. That's not a note that's meant to be applicable to variances only. That's a note that's applicable to your understanding of the dimensional requirements that are right above it. So unless there are any other questions, I'll rest for now.
Can I give the code enforcement officer an opportunity to enter any evidence into the hearing?
No, basically, like I said, as I said before, she come in for an application on 6/1/16 to remove residence and replace it with a new double-wide mobile home. They issued the permit. On 6/15/2016. And what I did was, obviously, I looked at 6.3 dimensional requirements, and if you look down through it, note 6, but even if you looked at note 1, note 2, setbacks may be reduced to the average of like setbacks of the existing structures. That's in my realm based on these dimensional requirements. Dimensional requirements are my obligation to read and enforce when I give out permits. Setbacks along railroad spurs may be waived for loading facilities and requirements. So these requirements, number 6, are the same idea. They're under the dimensional requirements and are allowed under my preview to administer. By doing the setbacks based on the reduced lot size, she has made that lot conforming as far as setbacks. So that's where I come up with my determination.
Okay. Anybody else have any evidence that they'd like to enter into the hearing before I close the public forum? All right, hearing no other evidence entered from the public, I'll close the public forum of the meeting and open it up to discussion amongst the board. At this point also, that the board, obviously, please feel free to ask any presenters for any additional information that you might be looking for as we go through discussions. Again, the one thing I would like to respectfully request is that as we are discussing the case amongst us, you know, in lieu of the code enforcement officer, that you don't just interject if we say something that you don't like, or as we're going along, I would respectfully request that you just don't interject at that point, because then it will just really probably break down and turn into an out of control forum. So again, I'll actually use just for everybody's understanding, and I'll actually go back to the LeMay's attorneys, because I think he stated it just very well. Again, the purpose that we're here for tonight is, you know, as the board's going to step into the CEO's shoes, basically start the review process from scratch and make its own independent decision as to whether the permit should be issued based on the facts presented to the board at the hearing. So I think that was captured probably exactly how the state also put it to us in this, you know, de novo hearing. Again, take the evidence that's been presented and work our way through the process on the validity of issuing a permit, or that the permit was issued in error and becomes basically void, as the LeMay's attorney has pointed out. I guess one of the difficult things on this is that, you know, there's now 5 code enforcement officers at the table. So, again, I would challenge us that I think that there's probably 2 routes or paths to you know, render a decision on this with the evidence that's in front of us, and that is, you know, one path I would see is that to basically go through some of the decision points in getting to the point of issuing a permit or non-issuing a permit, and you know, requiring a variance. So we could talk to those points kind of individually. I could start where I think they kind of break out into individual points. Or the other opportunity is really for each board member acting as their code enforcement officer to kind of render their own opinion of all the evidence that they have in front of them, and get basically to kind of a point in the discussion on how you feel, whether or not, again, the decision made originally by the code enforcement officer is valid, or again, that you would issue the permit in his shoes is the best way to put it, or whether or not you would not issue a permit if you were in his shoes. So I kind of see those are kind of the 2 paths that we can go to try and be 5 independent code enforcement officers and try and bring it to a conclusion before midnight. So, any preference? I mean, again, I think it could take a stab at leading the discussion on either path, if any perspective. Any perspective?
No, either way,
All right.
either way.
All right.
Either way.
Either way, all right, comes back to me.
Yep, comes back to you.
Can we hear from the, are we
mean-
gonna hear from the attorney first on that?
Sure. Again, it's just a suggestion, it's your decision how you wanna move forward, but I think it may be helpful to take each of the issues. The attorneys both did a really good job, I think, just laying out what the issues are in front of you. And it would be, and I think it's really 2 or 3. They can to the discretion of the chair, clarify if I'm wrong, but I think, and then take them one by one, and that way it's sort of clean and clear in terms of what you're deciding. So I think the first decision that's in front of you is whether, under the nonconformance provisions in section 5.2 of the ordinance, allowed for the replacement of the trailer that's been sort of teed up for you. Obviously, there's a disagreement. Mr. Pearson argues that ordinance provision does not allow the willful destruction and replacement, and Mr. Goldman argues that it does. So I think you need to make a decision on that, because that's at least that's been put in front of you. The second issue, after you decide that issue, is to decide what are the dimensional standards for side setback. That's specifically, I think, the issue right here. And that's really a decision on whether, under 6.3, you read note 6 as giving specific dimensional standards to allow that reduction, non-discretionary reductions. In other words, that is the standard? Or the alternative reading of that, Mr. Pearson has argued, is that really is more like a variance, and a limitation, in fact, on your ability to grant a variance, that it would have to come to you, and you would only be allowed to, note 6 really puts a limitation on your ability to create a variance, but based on the reduction of percentage. I think those are the two issues, and you're sitting in a de novo capacity on those two issues, as everyone sort of said. So I think that sort of I think would help clarify moving forward and not make it broad ranging, because there has not been an attack on the entirety of the permit. At least the way I see it, it's those two or three decisions. The final thing is, and you mentioned, I do want to just mention the case. I brought it up after the meeting was done. I let the attorneys know that there was a 2017 case, so it actually came out and was decided by the Maine Law Court, Maine Supreme Judicial Court, after this case that was before you was originally decided. So it was after the fact, but that was a case up in the town of North Haven, where Nebo Lodge was looking to expand their property, and a butter, and they got their approvals, and a butter appealed those decisions. And one of the arguments that the butter argued was, in the case of Nebo Lodge, what they did is they did two things. They first sought to tear down one of the two structures on the property, called the bungalow, and make an addition and call it an annex. So they're going to tear down the structure, create a new structure called the annex. And the second was they were going to expand it use. That's not really the issue. It's the tear down issue is the case. And one of the arguments that the butter argued was using very similar language that's in your ordinance, almost identical, in fact, that they could not willfully destroy and rebuild, because if you read that provision directly, the butter argued that it would prohibit the restoration or replacement of a willfully demolished, I'm reading just directly from the case, non-conforming structure, and to limit any restoration or replacement to the size of it. The law court held in that case that did not apply. That was not the correct reading of that ordinance provision, because they said that would, if you were to read it that way, it would essentially, and again I'm quoting, would effectively prohibit any voluntary alteration of a non-conforming structure, because a renovation would necessarily require damage to a structure. And more significantly, they went on to say there are clearly other provisions like yours that deal with enlargements and expansions and renovations of willfully destroyed, like in this case. So it's Mr. Pearson's obviously arguing that it's distinguishable, and I think that's an arguable point that will likely be discussed further. But it is a case that is on point to this case, and the takeaway for me is that the law court read very similar language to say, in a case where that it did not, and I'm not going to, because I don't want to put my spin particular, I just read what they said. They do not read it to effectively prohibit any voluntary alteration of a non-conforming structure. So it says that it expressly allows for and governs enlargements of non-conforming structures. So that case is out there. So I think that's informative. It clearly, if appealed, will be a case that a court will deal with again in this case. So it's important for you to know that case is out there. So I think that's the way I see it. It was just to create, and again, it's a suggestion, but to create some order to your decision making, is to go through those 1, 2, sort of 2.5, if you will. So it's whether what they did was allowed under the non-conforming provisions, what the dimensional standards for setbacks here are, and that component involves is that really supposed to be a variance, or can the code officer make that decision?
The good news was I was was exactly thinking just like you are.
Okay, good.
So, in terms of the questions that needed to be answered,
Yeah.
you put it really well with a kind of a 2.5.
Yeah.
Because again, I think there's the enlargement renovation piece as well as then the demo piece, and that's a kind of subset of that. And then you move into the variance piece, or variance requirement, the dimensional zones. All in agreement that we will work down the path of trying to come to, or at least put our evidence, our own perspective and evidence on each of those kind of areas. I can start just, again, I think in terms of the improvement and demolition point, and again, really, it's just focusing on the improvement piece and looking at, by the way, it's important that everybody recognize again, and it was provided by LeMay's attorney, that we are working obviously from the ordinance that was in play at the time. And that, of course, the ordinance has been changed in some areas. But, from, my working through the non-conformance section, where again, it starts with basically, paragraph A, general, continuous enlargement and reconstruction. And again, it talks to any non-conforming use or non-conforming structure may be continued, but may not be extended, reconstructed, enlarged, or structurally altered, except as specified below. And I think it's kind of important.
Section are you reading?
I'm sorry, I'm in 5.2 alpha. So, and to me, and so when I kind of put my point out there, at least in my interpretation of the ordinance in this area, is, to me, all the exceptions below are all the exceptions below. That doesn't just pertain to necessarily section A, that pertains to section A, B, C. Interestingly, D, there is no E. Not so sure why that's the case, and then F. So, but there is no E. And my perspective with that is as you work your way down, the ability to certainly renovate a structure, and even probably to the point even enlarge a structure. As you work your way down, non-conforming use, a structure non-conforming, which is B2, single-family dwellings, which non-conforming use may be enlarged as long as the dimensional requirements of the district in which they are located are met. So indicating that as you follow through that, properties can be enlarged, even enlarged if this were to be enlarged. That's not necessarily the case in this case, but as long as the dimensional requirements are, so again, kind of pointing down the road that if you were gonna enlarge and it was non-conforming, I think there's a general rule that, you shouldn't be making a non-conforming use more non-conforming. And certainly if you are gonna make it non-conforming, then it should come before the Board of Appeals, if there is a dimensional issue. It also follows, again, in section C, the next section, where similar language is in there for enlargements controlled, so implying that you can enlarge, or you can, expand, or you can modify, but it's controlled, and again, it kind of comes back into the, that you need a variance if you're, not in compliance with the dimensional requirements. And just kind of to finish the thought that in section D, that built lots has some similar language. If you're on a built lot, that the structure may be repaired, maintained, or improved, and may be enlarged if in conformity with all the dimensional requirements of this ordinance except lot area. Again, of this ordinance, a variance shall be obtained by the Board of Appeals if a variance were required. So just in my opinion, I was just trying to clarify to me in my head that and it goes to, I think, a comment that was made at a prior hearing, which was, hey, the ordinances were changed because you didn't allow structures to be, that was a little bit more specific to the tear down, but clearly, taking a structure and enlarging it certainly appears in the ordinance that there's multiple places where renovation, enlargement, et cetera, are allowed. However, if they are not conforming, if they violate the standards, the dimensional standards, then you have to come before the board. And just to kind of end the point on the first area, I guess this first area of replacement of the trailer and the enlargements. My straightforward interpretation of the restoration or replacement, and not that this necessarily answers the question, but I do believe the restoration or replacement paragraph that's in our ordinance, and again, just reading the language straight through, this ordinance allows the normal upkeep and maintenance of non-conforming uses and structures, repairs, renovations, and modernizations, which do not involve expansion of the non-conforming structures. But then it works its way down into, to talk to the very specificity of a structure, a non-conforming use or structure which is hereafter, and I think that's an important word, hereafter, damaged or destroyed by fire or any other cause other than the willful act of the owner or his or agent may be restored or reconstructed within 1 year of the date. And then it goes on to talk about, shall not be enlarged, a non-conforming structure shall not be enlarged in conformity with this, or except in conformance with this ordinance. Again, implying that if your house burnt down, which you would be allowed to build it, again, you could increase the size if you went in accordance with the ordinance. The reason I bring that part up is again, I believe that paragraph, and based on the hearing before, as well as evidence in this hearing, is that paragraph, in my opinion, specifically talks to a structure here and after that was damaged by fire or another problem. Which then leads me with, my interpretation of the fact that, the question before, can you demolish a structure or and then rebuild a structure or remove a structure and rebuild a structure? I guess, again, in my opinion, that can be done in accordance with the ordinance. Again, if it's, the intent should be that it's not increasing the nonconformity of the location, and that if it were increasing the nonconformity, then it should come before the Board of Appeals for a variance. If we're increasing the nonconformity, again, I should probably also, say that not increasing the nonconformity met the dimensional requirements, those things are allowed. If it did not meet those requirements, then it'd have to come to the Board of Appeals for a variance. And really, I'm just trying to kick off in my opinion, perspective of going through the first couple switches, which is renovation and enlargement allowed, and is demolition and rebuilding allowed as part of that definition. So I'm just going to put that out there as my opinion at this point. I'll open up the discussion to other members for their take. Or again, opportunity to ask any questions of the public if you need more evidence, whatever.
I tried really hard on this one too. I do feel that under 5.2A3, the restoration and replacement section, replacement was not plainly stated. So then I tried really hard to read through the legalese of everything that under that, and tried to understand what it could possibly mean. I kind of came up with the decision that maybe it was just plain not, overlooked or not actually stated what replacement should be when, in the ordinance. But you kind of hate to, I know when these things are done, they're not always perfect. Obviously, it's not very clear here. That's the way I felt. So it was difficult for me to come up, I felt that there isn't really anything extremely clear about replacement of a structure. So trying to use repairs, renovations, modernizations, you know, that type of thing, just to see how those would all fit, left me not feeling satisfied. I like, you know, I hadn't thought about it the way you had mentioned it, that any non-conforming use or structure which is hereafter damaged or destroyed by fire may be restored. So it's like, it's difficult to know whether they're saying that that's strictly about the fire, whereas the other things, of course, you know, if it's by the willful, you know, owner, that's, it was very difficult for me. I am interested in hearing other people's opinions about that. And I wouldn't mind also hearing I do better with something in front of me, so I'd like to hear again your description of that one court thing that if you would go over it again.
Yeah, sure.
Because I'm struggling with this part.
So, the town of North Haven had a very similar, if not identical, provision in their ordinance related to non-conformity. And I'll just read what their ordinance says. You can look at what ours says.
Okay.
Their ordinance said, quote, "Any non-conforming use or structure which is hereafter damaged or destroyed by fire of cause other than the willful act of the owner of his agent may be restored or reconstructed to its original dimensions and is used as before." So it's very similar. What the opponent, the neighbor who didn't like the approval in that case, argued because remember what the Nebo Lodge was doing was actually tearing down one of the two structures on a non-conforming lot and rebuilding it as the annex.
Okay, was there fire damage to that?
No.
No, okay. That's, okay.
So,
And it's not material as to whether it was enlarged or not.
right. And I'll just read it because I know Mr. Pearson characterizes it a certain way, so I'll just read it directly without my interpretation. Nebo Lodge operates an inn and restaurant in North Haven, sought to, quote, "tear down the bungalow, one of two existing structures on the property, and rebuild it as the annex." Okay, that's what they were asking to do. The neighbor said, using that provision, similar in this case, the willfully destroyed language that said, because of that provision, you cannot willfully destroy and rebuild on a non-conforming lot because it had some very similar language. The court said, Wilfram interprets section 2.6 to prohibit restoration or replacement of a willfully demolished non-conforming structure and to limit any restoration or replacement. The law court in that case concluded that that was the incorrect reading. We conclude that section 2.6 does not apply to a willful demolition for renovation purposes undertaken with municipal approval. Instead, that section concerns the repair or replacement of a non-conforming structure if it was damaged or destroyed by a fire or cause other than the owner's willful act. That's what the court said. The neighbor's interpretation would effectively prohibit any voluntary alteration of a non-conforming structure because a renovation would necessarily require damage undertaken intentionally by the owner or his agent. More significantly, such an interpretation would conflict with another section which allowed enlargements like you have in your ordinance for non-conforming structures and non-conforming lots.
Our section 5.2A general number 1 does allow for.
It does, and also in subsection C for non-conforming structures and subsection D for non-conforming lots, which directly addresses enlargements, they said in the case, allows for expansion of any non-conforming structure. So that's just what the case said.
Yes, sir, I feel it's appropriate. You can discuss.
I understand, I think the town's attorney gave a fair reading of the case. However, as many court cases, and I'm sure Phil will agree with me, frequently not all the facts get incorporated into the case. And I guess I would like, I'm reading now from a section of the town's brief before the law court. And it said that the town CEO, Mr. Quinn, approved the exact method of remodeling the accessory structure. Quinn responded, and Nebo relied on,
Can't hear you.
I'm sorry, pardon me?
That, I think you got competition upstairs. too.
No, okay, I'll try and speak louder. North Haven CEO, Mr. Quinn, approved the exact method of remodeling the accessory structure, and Nebo relied on the CEO's approval. Quinn responded to a question by the BOA with regard to the remodeling of the accessory structure. CEO Quinn clarified that the northwest corner of the old accessory building was saved and now holds up a corner of the stairs. In other words, it was not a total demolition of the property. It was a demolition of a significant part of the property, and it's, I think, as the law court recognized, whenever you do remodel or you renovate something, there's a certain amount of demolition involved. But the key thing here is, and it's not entirely clear in the law court's decision, that a portion of the building remained in the new building. And that, in my opinion, and that's for you to decide, clearly distinguishes it from the situation before the board tonight. If you would like a copy of what I just read, I can provide it, or not, if it's helpful. But
Yes, sir, only in fairness.
So what we've just seen is, the tool in every lawyer's tool bag is the attempt to distinguish on the facts the bad law. And no two cases are going to be exactly the same, so we're never going to find a case that's exactly like the facts that were presented here. The bottom line is that, even under the facts as they were just described here, which is the facts as told by one side, not as incorporated by the Maine Supreme Court, all that was left in that case was a wall, like part of a wall. And I don't see any material difference between leaving a piece of a wall, so you could say, oh, now I've, modernized or repaired this wall that I've left behind, versus just tearing down that little section of the wall and building the new structure. I don't think that attempt to distinguish on the facts really is material with respect to what we have here. And I'll just say, just bringing it back around, because there's been some talk about enlargement. The facts are that there was no enlargement to make it more non-conforming.
Close that. I do have one question on pertaining to really, both of what you're discussing here. In the work that was done on this property, was any portion of the original structure or foundation left to remain, or was it, from an evidence perspective, was everything removed and a new foundation or a new pad and a new structure put up?
The CEO may know. My understanding is that essentially that there was no foundation. It was a mobile home replaced by a modular home.
Okay. There was a slab. Did the slab remain?
But I think they put a new one on. I think they put a new one down. Yeah, I believe they put a whole new
Okay.
one down.
All right. So we all agree that. Okay. So we all agree that what was there
Right, I don't
before
think
is
that's an
gone,
issue.
and what was there now is all new. Okay. Thank you.
I'm gonna pipe up here a little bit. I mean, one of the standards that was discussed at the workshop was the plain words, read the plain words, and we can go a long way in doing that. But to me, as John pointed out, section 5.2A3 starts with two keywords in my mind: restoration or replacement. The rest of the paragraph does not go back and reiterate either one of those two words, but it does talk about repairs and renovations or modernizations. And I guess, to me, I can read modernizations as meaning replacing with a new structure. I can get to that from just a plain reading, and that would be, to me, the intent of that section would be to allow. I mean, how are you gonna replace an old mobile home? With a new one. And I know we've changed the statute, but that's only because, you know, we have situations where if it doesn't specifically say it, then it doesn't necessarily follow that it's not prohibited, as a lot of other people want us to think. But because it doesn't specifically say it, it doesn't specifically prohibit it either, so. That's how I feel.
And I interpret that the same way when it says replacement. You know, it's not, it doesn't say you gotta leave part of anything.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
When it says replacement, it doesn't say you have to leave part of the building, whatever, you're replacing.
Yeah,
How old was that mobile home? Can I ask that question? The old mobile home, how old was it?
it was in 1960.
So we are 2016, 56 years later.
Okay, so I mean, I believe at this point,
On that issue.
I believe at this point, you know, again, I think we're at the crossroads of the board's ability to make a decision on whether or not the improvement itself, you know, the improvement itself and that improvement including the you know, demolition and rebuilding or building of a new structure was allowed underneath the ordinance. Again, we can have further discussion on that, but I believe that's the crossroads that we're at right now.
I'm kind of wondering, so this isn't, that isn't anything at all that the code enforcement officer considered. You were concerned with the dimensional things, right?
With, in,
You were concerned with the dimensions of
yeah, I looked
of
at all
this.
of that.
Yeah, but the idea that they were replacing it, it didn't come up
Correct.
for you
It-
as,
as long as it met the dimensional requirements. And in the 6.3, it says you can reduce the setbacks to make it
Yep, yeah,
conforming,
right,
and that's what I went by.
okay.
I mean, I guess again, we can either decide to, you know, render a decision on at least a portion of this at this point, or we could continue to move forward. Again, I believe the next switch we would work our way through would be the dimensional discussion, that whether or not the code enforcement officer, again, whether or not, so I think there's two aspects of this. Again, that was presented by the LeMay's attorney in their brief and presented today, which is, again, was a variance required? Was, and again, that would mean that note 6 could not be applied by the code enforcement officer, or again, my opinion on the interpretation of what's in front of us. again, that the code enforcement officer did not have the authority to utilize note 6 on his own, and it would have required that to apply that dimensional reduction would have had to come before the Board of Appeals, I believe. Again, because if a variance was required, then the issuing of the permits would have been null and void at that point. And I think in addition to that discussion is the interpretation. On a math perspective, you have to come down to the interpretation on how, if note 6 was allowed to be applied, was it applied correctly? So again, do you want to continue to move on to discussing the dimensional setbacks? Or
Are you looking, if you wanna do it on a point-by-point basis, are you looking, Mr. Chairman, for a motion, so to speak?
to be honest with you, we could do it either way. We could collect them all at the
I
end,
understand.
or we can collect them
So we can do
individually.
it by motion on each
Right.
one, or we can
Yeah.
do it at the end.
Yeah. Yep, so again, the two general requirements that were put in front of, that we decided on moving forward was, again, was this modernization, repair, improvement allowed in accordance with the ordinance, including the raising of the existing structure and rebuilding? That's essentially what's in front of us.
Also move that, just to get us going.
Okay, so I have a motion, I guess I'll have to recapture exactly what I just said. I have a motion that the improvement / modernization / repair of the structure was allowed in the ordinance, including the raising of the structure and rebuilding,
Replacing.
or replacing. It's probably a good word to use. Better word.
Allowed under 5.2, or,
Allowed, I was just gonna say allowed in accordance with the
okay,
ordinance.
and according to the ordinance.
Yeah.
I second the motion, if you're,
All right, I have a second on the motion. Any further discussion? Okay, hearing no further discussion, again, I'll start on my right for the vote,
Um,
and your roll call.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I forgot which way you're gonna do it.
What's that?
I just wanna make sure I'm voting the right way.
Okay, yeah, let me explain.
I can just
I-
say
Yeah, look,
my opinion.
So voting yes would, again, you would be concurring that the aspect of the repair, modernization, restoration of the property was performed in accordance with the ordinance, including raising the structure and replacing it.
I vote no.
Okay.
Campbell?
I vote yes.
I vote yes.
I vote yes.
Yes.
On the side setback dimension, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
You have the floor.
I'm of the feeling that the ordinance, as far as section 6.6, note 6, does not require the applicant or the code enforcement officer to get a variance. I think it's part of his function to oversee and apply that process. And that there was no need for a variance on the side setback as far as I'm concerned. But the general note takes care of it. And that's it, that's his part of his function, is to apply those notes to the process.
I agree. I think, I totally agree with that. And I did my math calculations, and I think the code enforcement officer's math calculations were correct. And I also went back and looked at note 6, which I will do again. Well, and it says that you, whether it seems to be correct or not, in our ordinance, it says that you use the lot size. So the percentage that the non-conforming lot is less than the requirement. So it doesn't take, it's not the length of a side, it's the lot. So, and I think he used the lot and came up with that mathematics.
The lot area.
Yeah, well, it says the lot, so the lot, it's not one side or a side dimension or a front dimension or something like that. So I believe that that was all done correctly and in accordance with our ordinance.
Joe, I have a question for you. Other than the definition of a code enforcement officer, is there any other section in here that talks to your duties? Other than enforcing the entire ordinance?
Yeah, just what it says.
So just the definition? Okay, I just wanted to, if I was to be pointed in some other direction, I wanted to make sure. Okay. So again, I also believe that, or, you know, my interpretation of that table is that the notes are to be utilized in the determination, what I'll call the original determination of whether or not setback or, you know, or that the dimensional requirements are being met at the code enforcement level. Now there's another, you know, application here in terms of that was presented in evidence, which was is the dimensional requirement really based on square footage or based on, you know, the difference between, I should read the words exactly how they're read, and then I can probably better phrase my perspective on it. You know, for all structures, side and rear setbacks may be reduced by the percentage that the non-conforming lot is less than the requirement. Again, I believe the word lot really lends itself to square footage being the factor that is used. And I think in order to, again, kind of validate that perspective is, and with respect to this particular case, and again, my opinion, is there was one, you know, in the evidence it was provided that the, I think the frontage was 150 feet of the existing lot, and the current lot size, I believe, is 70 feet. 150 feet is required, currently 70 feet. Again, that came out to like 47% or something like that. And then that was applied to the side setbacks. And again, another reason why I kind of come back to lot and square footage is because, and it's my engineering brain that kind of pushed me down this road, but was also thinking of that, well, if you applied that if you were gonna apply a rule in that fashion, that the 70 versus 150 would be applied to that setback. And in this case, that the existing property was 3 or 4 feet off the abutting property, and where the requirement would be 25, you know, which would then apply, would be about a 12%, you know, so getting into all the numbers, which would actually further reduce the requirement and make the current setback that the home is currently at even more. I think the evidence by the LeMay's attorney said that the requirement would be 11 feet 8 inches, vice the 7 or 8 feet that they're currently at, and that was interpreting the 150 versus 70. And again, when I looked at that, I was kind of like, well, setbacks should be kind of, if you were to even go down that path, setbacks should match. If you were gonna use the less than rule and apply the percentage, well, you would do that on the front, and you would do that on the side, and you would do that kind of independently, not just, I think it's hard to make that validation that the front would then apply to all the sides. And so, but again, I think the strongest word in there is lot, and lot. Yep, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
Have you ever applied that standard or that note 6 to any other time, Joe?
On other structures, not, you know, I have used it, that's because that's what it's for.
You have used it in the
Yeah.
past and applied it, and you've always used the square footage and the
Based
lot
on
in
the
that
lot.
sense. And again, to me, it's just a reading of the plain language of
That's what
plain
I
words.
read.
That I would also agree that on the, that we use the square footage as was used by the code enforcement officer. I agree with Pat.
And it-
So
and
we
agree-
need motions.
And from an evidentiary perspective, the home currently is at 7 or 8 feet from the abutter's property line. The calculation came to 5.75 feet, I believe. I just,
5.75 from the front.
from the, that was the side setback
Yeah,
requirement.
the Jones letter says that.
Yeah. So again, the I mean, any more discussion before, I was just gonna reiterate the second item that we were really, second switch we were working our way through. What's that? Oh, sorry.
It's my opinion that the code enforcement officer followed 9.2, which is what he's supposed to do as far as ensuring that the application is proper initially. But I want to ask just a point of fact, the foundation or the new slab or footing, it's not bigger than the previous one? I would think not, because there's no need of it being bigger than the previous one. Okay, that's what I thought.
Section, are you in section?
Well, it's just generally what the enforcement
9,
officer,
okay.
code enforcement says, 9.3. Pertains and addresses more to stick-built houses and additions, but it does, I mean, follow, he would have to do that anyway for anything. Continuance, enlargement, reconstruction, restoration, or replacement.
So as the second switch we were, or second decision block, again, was a variance required, as is, as our language in section 5 points to with respect to modernizations. Again, if they were dimensionally not gonna meet if a unit was not gonna meet the dimensional requirements, it would have had to come before the Board of Appeals. So really, the question in front of us, or what we're trying to decide here is simply, was a variance required? Was a variance required? It's really that simple.
I make a motion that there was no variance required for the dimensions of the
I'll second
property.
it. I'll second it.
Okay, so I have a motion that no variance was required. I have a, for dimensional requirements. I have a second. Any further discussion?
Should be according
According to paragraph 6.3, specifically with interpretation of note 6.
Note 6.
Again, since I just kind of restated the question, so, do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Any further discussion? Okay, roll call vote.
Over
All right, I just want to make sure it's right.
Oh, sorry.
Said right.
So voting yes in the affirmative, I believe again the way that I phrased the question, so I phrased it, no variance was required. So voting yes means that no variance was required and that the permit would be issued if you were the code enforcement officer.
Okay, I vote yes.
Campbell?
I vote yes.
Yes.
I vote yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so because it was sort of,
I'll make,
you should now, so since you said there's no variance, I think you should decide whether it meets the dimensional standards now, in the ordinance, based on your interpretation of the square footage, or however you wanna do it. Meets or doesn't meet, I should say, to be neutral, but does it, now that you say it's something that the code officer can apply, or you can apply in this situation, I think before you is, does it meet it? Did they meet the standard using note 6?
So I make a motion, does the existing permit meet the dimensional requirements? Or does the project meet the dimensional requirements of section 6.3 of the ordinance?
Specifically related setback, side setback?
Specifically related to, all dimensional requirements.
Okay.
So,
second.
so a vote, yes, affirmative of this is that the project does meet, basically, again, putting ourselves in the shoes of being a code enforcement officer. In your opinion, does the project meet the dimensional requirements, all dimensional requirements as established in paragraph 6.3?
You mind if I just get a clarification on your motion? Because I think the argument and the discussion so far has really just been about this side setback issue, so I would suggest you limit it to that. There hasn't been any suggestion that any of the other dimensional requirements, at least that I saw in the arguments, have been met, so I don't want you to make some broad determination that isn't in front of you. I think what you're being asked limitedly is, does it meet the side setbacks in section 6.3 as affected by note 6?
I'll amend my motion. Again, the project in question, does the project in question meet the side setback requirements as established in paragraph 6.3 dimensional requirements? Actually, Yep.
I think the chair has stated the motion as a question.
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree.
Just so that
Oh,
the
sorry.
record is clear.
Yeah.
all right. Yeah, and you're right,
Yeah.
that does in front.
Good point.
Okay. All right, I'll just leave it, the project meets the side setback dimensional requirements as established in paragraph 6.3 dimensional requirements.
And applying note 6. You have to-
In my-
You have to get to note 6 to get to the side setback that we.
I'm including note 6, well, in my opinion, that note 6 is included in that. We had already
We're being
decided.
redundant, but I think we need to be.
Okay. All right, so including the requirements established by note 6. Did you get all that, Joe?
Yes.
Okay,
Second.
I'll second that, but,
okay.
I mean, is the real discussion on this motion, the square footage issue? Is that?
As in note 6,
as
the way
in
it
note
says.
6?
Yeah, why don't you, now that you've made the motion, it's been seconded that it meets the side setback, why don't you make some findings here on what the actual setback needs to be? I think you've already said it as part of your discussion. It's been suggested that it was 5.75, but that's still based on a calculation of the percentage of the lot size. But it would be helpful for you to
I mean, I
just
can.
make that determination now, so it informs your motion.
Okay.
I have the dimensions and whatever. So the percentage, the percentage that we're talking about is 76.8%. The 13,939 feet out of the, and the 46,061 would add up to 60,000. And their lot has only the approximately 14,000, so it would be approximately 77%. And if you apply that 77% to the side, then the original one was 12% of the size. The new one is better than the 77. Oh, I have it. I'm looking for my better one.
No, you have to apply the percentage of the 23 to the side.
Okay, the
original side
23 or-
setback
yes.
Of 25 feet.
Or the 77, whichever way you want to figure it out.
Yeah,
But the new,
23% is
the
applied to the
new,
side.
Right.
the new
Okay.
7 out of 25 is 28%, which is greater than the 23% required.
So the existing requirement was 5.75 feet. And again, I think it's been offered in evidence is that the setback of the new property is 7 to 8 feet.
Yeah.
Did you do that math back? Of the 28%, did you do that math? What does that amount to?
The which one?
28%.
The 28% is 7 feet over 25 feet.
So you're saying that currently they're at 28% versus
7%,
23%.
7
So
feet.
again, we're
Which is
saying that.
better than the 23% that's
Correct.
necessary.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, I believe we have a motion, we have a second. Voting yes concurs that it meets the dimensional requirements as established in table 6.3. Discussion is put on the table the exact dimensional evidence that's been put in front of us. So,
Over
Yes.
there, Campbell,
Yes.
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 Mr. Chair, I don't mean to elongate the evening, but I wanna make sure you're getting everything you need to do, so it doesn't come back to you. Even though Mr. Pearson did mention it tonight, he did mention it the first time we were together, and he does make one further argument that I think you should vote on. Mr. Pearson argues that the permit didn't comply, the application didn't comply with all the submission requirements. And I know we heard from Joe on that last time, or in writing about there was a site plan, or whether there's a site plan or not. I just wanna make sure we have a finding on that, so that it doesn't come back up if it's raised, if this is appealed and raised this here.
Well, if I remember your discussion, it was also there was a septic, there was a, I think Mr. Pearson brought up that there was no septic plan either, but I think you responded by saying not necessary, because the existing system was gonna be, was already there, and they were gonna utilize the existing system, is that correct?
that's correct.
So again, I'll ask, from an evidence perspective,
No, that's the old.
so to the code enforcement officer, just, was the application complete with perspective to applications you routinely receive?
Want me to answer that? Yes, there was.
Okay. Yeah, all right.
I used the site plan from a previous application,
Okay.
and they had the floor plan. And like I said, a septic wasn't necessary based on the fact that it was already existing.
And I think the other thing that Mr. Pearson brought up was that the site plan, there was no site plan showing, or nothing in the application showing the location of the structure. But I think that was, in my mind, cured by the fact that Mr. Lucelle went out on October 10, I believe, according to my notes, October 19, where he made a physical inspection and determined that the side setback had been already there, and specifically that the slab was there. So that obviously to me would be some kind of a plan, at least that's where the intent was, to put the new structure.
Is there somewhere in our booklet here, because I don't find in my information here, somewhere here in the booklet that someone knows that tells us exactly what application is supposed to include?
Yes.
That's in 9.2.
9.2?
John pointed to that earlier.
9.2?
That's towards the end, actually. What it's supposed to include.
Yeah, what's the thing, what's
shape of the lot is one location.
Yeah, yeah, I've looked at it.
I do not think that we had a complete application. But I can't say what was missing because I don't have it all in
This is
front of me.
the old one from 2016. I would say this is the original one, or copies of the original one. It's 70 feet by 200 feet.
Right, but, okay, here it is on here. Well, I think there's a sheet that's missing out of here that says what is supposed to be included, you know, of the, so where is it in? Do you have a copy of it, Joe? The, you know, the actual, it says what has to be included in it. Did you find it?
I think I can find that.
Actually, if you look at the application, it's got all the pages in, doesn't.
There's the application right there, and it has
This
everything
is we're
listed.
addressing this issue based on characterization of Attorney Pearson's argument. I would just like the opportunity to speak briefly. Whenever you're ready to hear, go ahead and stand this issue.
But I think, Pat, that do you have a copy of Mr. Pearson's memo?
I do.
Okay, but I think if you go to page 4, paragraph D, of Mr. Pearson's,
What do you,
I'm talking about the Mr. Attorney Pearson's memo.
That's this one.
right,
Yeah.
I do, but I have that.
That's
Oh,
what
jump
he's
it up.
raising. Those are the only requirements of the application that he's raising, those are the issues he's raising, are those 3?
I'm looking, page 4.
Yep, paragraph D.
Okay.
And
All
those
right,
three-
before I finish this,
the 3 bullet points.
Includes my reference to plan. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have anything that shows showing the structure to be erected along, you know, where on the lot is supposed to be. You know, this is what we have. And the size, shape, and location of all existing structures. We only have a plan from 1993 and, or whatever the date was on that one, that we don't know if this,
Those are on file, right? I think he said they're on file.
but we don't know what's still there now, you know, I mean, there's, I don't know. The site plan shows the location of the proposed structure to ensure compliance with the setbacks.
I think it says to show the structures, Pat, at the time the application was made, the existing structures then, not after the demolition and replacement.
The site plan showing the structure to be erected, along with the size and shape of the lot.
We're not reading the same, are you reading from Mr. Pearson's memo
Yes, I am.
on number 1?
Well, under D, right before his conclusion,
Right?
the permit should not have been issued because the application did not comply with the requirements of the
Right.
ordinance.
a site plan showing the structure at the time of all the existing structures at the time of the application of the permit. Is that correct?
Show me what you're doing, Ron. Show me which part I'm supposed to be looking at. I'm looking at this.
Yes. Right, but I think the key thing is that existing structures that
Yes.
were there at the
If we have a
time of
question,
the
sir.
application.
But we don't have anything.
But Joe says he had that on file for the existing existing structures. That's what he's saying. Because she had applied for some of the information Mr. Pearson had provided, some of the permits before. Remember seeing those permits?
Yes.
Yeah,
That's
and
the
those
old
were
one.
structures.
Yeah, the old one.
Right, the old ones. So I think it's what Joe was referring to, that he had those on file. Is that right, Joe?
And it
Right,
shows
the-
the location of the proposed.
Most of the information is in the file property.
Right.
Sir, I'll allow you to make your point. Go ahead, sir.
I would just ask the board to look at section 9.2 of the ordinance,
That's what we
rather than
have.
my argument on it.
We're all open to 9.2. No, we are not, but I am. Sir, quickly, yep.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna draw your attention to a specific section of the ordinance, 9.2B1, which talks about how upon receipt of a permit application, the code enforcement officer shall.
Hang on a second, hang
Oh,
on a second.
sure.
Where's
9 point what?
9.2B1.
Page 109 in the new version.
B1?
B1.
D1?
B,
B
as in boy.
Bravo. Page 109 in the,
B1. All right.
It says, upon receipt of a permit application, the code enforcement officer shall, 1, decide whether the information in the application is sufficient for him/her to determine whether under the ordinance the permit should be issued, or if the application is otherwise inadequate. If he/she feels the application is insufficient or inadequate, he/she shall at once notify the applicant in writing, indicating to him/her what information is necessary to correct the application. If the application is not so corrected, he/she shall deny it. The CEO never informed my client that any additional information was necessary because no additional information was necessary. He had the information in the file. He saw it with his own eyes. He didn't do the condition predicate to denying the permit for whatever, minor discrepancy there was between what was actually in the application and what technically might have been required.
yes, sir.
Respond to that. What the CEO did or did not do is not an issue before the board. The board, as the chairman pointed out, needs to step into the shoes and make the decision tonight de novo as if it is the CEO. And so I would say that you need to look at the permit application as submitted and make a determination as to whether it is complete. And obviously, I've argued on behalf of LeMays that it is lacking a site plan.
And I'll just say quickly in response to that is true. But that just means that you have the same discretion the CEO had to say that all the information that was necessary was there. And also, strangely, it implies that if you were to deny it on that basis now, first you'd have to give my client notice and an opportunity to cure these technical deficiencies. But I don't think that's necessary because, as the CEO said, he had all the information he needed, and now you have all the information you need.
Everybody's all ready for discussion?
I just want to point out that you have in the record, both from the first time around and also through the submission of Mr. Pearson's submissions, a copy of the building permit, which included various other exhibits to it, including a floor plan, and there's some drawings on the street structure, separate grid plan, the code enforcement officer's letters, and also what I believe is the old plan. So that is actually in front of you, the same information appears that Mr. Roussel had.
That's the original application. But there's another site plan
Right.
that's much more detailed. We've been flipping through so many pages, it's starting to get convoluted.
Yes.
We had on the record before these, the permits that were previously applied for.
Yep, those are part of the, have them there. We're in the package that was provided.
The older one?
From 16?
Yeah. That's the original,
Yeah.
that's the
So
permit.
That's got the older design from what was
Right,
originally on the line.
right, but there was, I seen where I think it was Mr. Pearson gave us exhibits of.
This is what I'm.
Mr. Pearson and
and,
both
no,
applicants.
exhibits of permits were applied back in 1990 or 1989 or.
Yeah.
1993?
Yes, and there's the design there.
We didn't get that.
It's in
Plus
the
there's
file.
also, there's also the site plan.
Yes.
I may not have gotten
I mean, up to
That's-
date.
That's in the file.
You know,
that doesn't-
right there.
Yeah.
So that's
Right.
on there.
That's part of the record. So,
Again, we do have to come to a conclusion on this decision, or on this aspect of the information provided. Again, from a discussion perspective, again, I put a lot of, go ahead, sir. But again, as pointed, again, going to 9.2B1, again, it's up to the code enforcement officer to decide whether or not the application is complete. And I think, again, putting myself in the code enforcement officer's shoes with the evidence provided, of which, by the record, evidence was provided that was on record with the town as well at the time.
I'll make a motion.
All right, again, but my perspective is that the, site plan, he had access, or I would have access to similar information as well, so.
I'll make a motion that the application was complete enough.
I would, make a motion, well, again, I'll wait to see if that's seconded.
Are we gonna do any more discussing?
Well, I was-
You need a second before you
I'll
get to
second it.
Now we can discuss.
Discussion? I would recommend that, again, I think the term you used was the application was complete enough. I would recommend that the wording be changed, that the application was sufficient, had sufficient information
Could be
to make a
issued.
determination.
To be issued.
The application had sufficient information to make a determination.
With prior records on file.
Amended.
And as a,
Amend my motion.
yeah, so I'd like to amend Mr. Vig's motion again, that the application had sufficient information to render a decision.
I second the amendment. Have to vote on the amendment first.
Yeah, further discussion?
I don't understand if we're voting on the exact application that we have in front of us, the little packet with 5 things about the
No, it's
Are
not
we-
confined to that packet, but
it's
all of the record.
all of the information that was
Yeah.
given us?
That,
Is
that the,
that-
app. No, I think it's, again, my motion is that the application had sufficient information to render a decision. I could further say in accordance with permit paragraph 9.2B1, which
Wait,
is,
I guess I'm not saying that. I guess I'm confused because we received a lot of information, old pictures as well as, old permits and, the whole history? Or are we talking about just the application that was submitted to us about this case? Just the ELIA permission?
so putting, I believe, from a discussion perspective, putting ourselves in the code, as code enforcement officers, 5 code enforcement officers at the table, it's the application that was submitted at the time the application was submitted.
And looking at the file that was there.
Well, that's what I mean. Are we
And
looking
we
at
had
the
some of
file?
the information of the file
We're
with
looking
those
at the
prior
file.
permits and so, prior permits with those, with the configurations, for the site stuff and plan, so.
Do you see anywhere where the amount of the setback was shown or written? The amount of the new setback?
The new setback?
It was shown to be
Beyond the 3 feet?
Joe, where does this diagram come from?
That was in the file. That was a prior. That showed that the existing house was 3 feet off the property.
Right.
I don't understand.
And what was used to determine what the new dimension was going to be?
When I went through 6
Believe
points,
that,
No, I guess, how did you come to the determination that the home was going to be 7 to 8 feet off of the side? Okay, I might be missing something here. The calculation says that the side setback was limited to 5.75
that is
feet.
Joe Russol's
However,
notes.
testimony shows, and your letter shows that, I believe your letter said that the side setback was going to be, at least what was testified, was that the side setback was gonna be 7 or 8 feet. Not the side setback, that the real dimension that the house was gonna be placed at was gonna be 7 or 8 feet.
I explained to them
Okay,
that they could reduce it down to 5.75 feet.
okay,
I said, you need to move it at least 7 to 8 feet off the property line to make sure that the overhang and everything else would meet that setback.
all right, that's what I was looking for. I was trying to understand where that number came from.
So when they put the slab down, then I went out and measured.
Okay.
And that is in the record from October 16th.
So you're saying at the time you couldn't have put the exact thing on the,
No, we had to make sure it was exact.
yeah, okay. Got it.
So I have a motion on the table that's been seconded, that, and again, I won't necessarily repeat it exactly, I'm sure that I repeated last time, but that the application had sufficient information for a determination to be made with respect to,
9.2, Section B.
thank you, 9.2, Section B1. In accordance with Section 9.2, B1. Any further discussion?
Good.
Okay, again, just for further clarification, you know, a yes vote indicates that it was in conformance with the ordinance, a no vote indicates that it was not in conformance with the ordinance. Pat, I'll start with you.
Yes.
Campbell?
Yes.
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 So now I think you just have to take a final vote to approve or deny the
Issue the
appeal.
permit.
Yeah. It's an administrative appeal of the decision, so I think you would approve or, you would either approve or deny the appeal. Yeah.
That means what?
If you deny the appeal, the permit continues to be, you're upholding the issuance of the permit.
I'll make a motion the appeal be denied.
I second the motion.
I hate being the first one. And
That's
so-
fine, no, so for clarity,
Thank
you
you.
know, again, denying the appeal,
Is the
again, it's
motion to
denying.
deny?
The
Yes.
motion was to
Is
deny.
deny the appeal. Mhm.
Deny the appeal
Yep.
from the LeMays and their representative,
Mhm.
And the permit continues
the permit, right, and
in effect.
So I vote yes, I would like it to continue.
I vote to deny the appeal and to continue the enforcement of the building permit. So I vote yes.
yes,
Thank you. Yes.
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 And I think we can make a motion to adjourn.
I'll move and we adjourn.
I second it.
All in favor? This can just be a hand vote.
Aye.